Welcome back to World War II Jeep and Rifle. On today's episode, I'll be going over tie rod end replacement. The tie rod ends are a wearable item, part of the steering mechanism. And in my case, my tie rod ends not only are worn, but the grease seals are ruptured, and I'll show you how to replace them. We will follow TM 9-803, the technical manual, but I'll provide you with a few tips that aren't included. Stay tuned for more. Underneath the Jeep, we're looking at the pivot arm, where one end of each of the two tie rods is connected. And one of them is removed. It's back in the shop. Here's one tie rod end connected to the pivot arm. The other end of this tie rod is connected to the spindle arm on the wheel. Here's the spindle arm over here. And this clearly shows the castellated nut. You can see that it's got slots in it. The slots allow a cotter pin to be threaded through a hole in the bolt and held in place through the castellations, or these notches in the nut. So the tie rod ends are removed by removing the cotter pin, removing the nut, and then driving out the end of the tie rod from its respective arm, the spindle arm and the pivot arm. Driving it out takes some force, and I'll demonstrate that now. Hold on. There are different ways to pull a tie rod end, but it's important that you have the right tools. This is a tie rod separator tool, and you use it to drive out the tie rod end. So it's got a wedge-shaped fork on the front. The fork straddles the tie rod ends threaded the bolt, and then you use a hammer to drive that out, and eventually it will separate and pop that tie rod end out of its place. Okay, hold your ears. There we go. So do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll take the tie rod with the ends in place back into the shop and talk about the next step. Back in the shop, I have the tie rod we just pulled off the Jeep laid out across this ruler. Before I start disassembling it, it's important that we measure it. The alignment on the front end of the Jeep is controlled by the length of these tie rods, and the length of the tie rod is determined by how many threads you screw in the each tie rod end, and each tie rod end can add about 3/64 of an inch of length to the tie rod. So I'm measuring it, and this one is exactly 26 inches. And when I put the new tie rod ends in, I will screw them in and then clamp them in place so that I have the same length as the tie rod that I just took off. That way I don't mess with the alignment, which was good on the Jeep to begin with. So let's take the tie rod clamps off. These tie rod clamps keep the tie rod end from changing position by threading in or out over time. And in order to get the tie rod ends off, you have to take the clamps off first. With the tie rod clamps off, now the tie rod ends should freely loosen, and you can remove the tie rod ends from the tie rod. The special tip to understand is that one of these tie rod ends is left-handed threaded, and the other is conventional threading, right-handed. And if you have a stubborn tie rod end and you're trying to put some elbow grease into it to get it out, you may be tightening it if you're not turning it in the proper direction for its threading. So for example, this tie rod end is left-handed threads. I'm turning it clockwise and it feels unnatural, but it is coming out. And the one that I replace it with will also be left-handed threaded, this one. The other tie rod end on each tie rod is conventionally threaded, right hand. And so I'll take these old ones out, put the new ones in, make sure that they are assembled so that the tie rod end has the same length as it did when I took it off. And then I'll take it back over to the Jeep to install it. Back under the Jeep again with my two assembled tie rods. You're sure to notice this, but one of the tie rods has its bolt facing up, one side has it facing down. And so I find the easiest way to do this, with the castellated nut removed from the shaft of the tie rod end, if you just use gravity to your favor, you can get one end of the tie rod inserted so that gravity holds it in place while you position the other end and then get the castellated nut back on. Be sure, if your tie rod ends are like mine's, these new old stock tie rod ends, you need to be sure that the washer and the spring are held in place before you attach the tie rod in. So there you go. You can use the steering wheel to kind of give yourself a little flexibility. You tighten these castellated up nuts up a little bit, not too much, and then hold them in place with a cotter pin. Once you've got both your tie rods on, then the job's done. So the two big tips: number one, use a tie rod separator tool to get the old tie rod ends off. Number two, one of the tie rod ends is left-handed threads, and you'll drive yourself nuts trying to loosen it if you don't know that ahead of time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like the video, and we'll keep showing you more. See you next time.